Hey everyone, welcome back to Positively Fishing and part 2 of our rod building series. Today, we're going to build the handle of our fishing rod. The first thing that we need to do is lay out all the supplies that we'll be needing to build our rod handle. We have our handle pieces, including the cork grips and reel seat, winding checks, masking tape, grease pencil, popsicle sticks and 2-part rod building epoxy, cork reamers, and of course our 7-foot rod blank. The first thing we need to do is find the spine or spline of the rod. To do that, you need to take the butt of the rod and put it on a smooth flat surface, and take one of your hands and put it about 3/4 of the way up the rod. Take your other hand, flex the rod in the middle, and then roll it. And you'll be able to feel a spot where the rod kind of clicks into place, and that's where the spine of the rod is. The reason we need to mark the spine of the rod is that tells us where we're going to put our guides. Now that I've found it, I need to take a grease pencil and mark on the rod in a few different places where that spine is. The reason I mark it in a few different places is it helps me line it up later with the reel seat and all the guides. The next thing we have to do is lay out and mark our handle pieces. And we do this just by laying it against the rod and marking it with our grease pencil. The reason we lay out and mark these is when we're epoxying and when we're reaming out our cork, it helps to know where the pieces are going to end up. The next thing we have to do is ream out our cork. The cork comes from the factory with a 1/4 inch hole in it. And right now, if I try to slide it down our rod, it will only get down about halfway. And this needs to go all the way down to the end of the rod. So what we have to do is use a cork reamer to hollow out the inside of this cork to make the opening in the inside bigger. This gets a little bit messy, so I'm going to do this out in the garage. Reaming out the cork is actually pretty simple. It's just as simple as running this reamer through the cork, and as it goes through the cork, it sands the inside of it out and makes that opening bigger and bigger. This takes a little while, so we'll come back after it's done. Okay, I've been reaming this cork out for a little while. Now let's see how we're doing. Doing better. Still got a little ways to go. Okay, it looks like we are about there. Let's give it a check. Now it slides all the way down. Slides all the way down to the end of the rod. So now the next step is we have to ream out the foregrip. The foregrip is the same process as the butt grip. We start out with that 1/4 inch hole down the center. We can slide it down the rod to check where it needs to go. Now this one doesn't need to go all the way down to the end. This is why we marked this earlier. This piece here only needs to go down to where we marked it when we laid out the rod handle. So we don't need to be able to ream it out for it to fit all the way down, just to right here. I should mention also that I actually have 2 reamers, a smaller one to start with and then a bigger one for the larger diameter rods. You can buy these in the store. I happen to make these out of some sandpaper and an old broken fishing rod. All right, let's get started on the foregrip. When you're reaming the cork with a reamer that's tapered, like these are, you want to start from the back of it, and it kind of matches the same taper as a normal fishing rod, especially these because they were actually made from fishing rods. It's always good to check every now and then so you don't go too far. So we're still about 1 foot away, so we got a little bit more to go. All right, let's give that another check. That is perfect. All right, the next step is to glue it up. Okay, now that we have our cork reamed out so it fits the taper of our rod, we need to mix up our 2-part epoxy and glue them in place. The type of epoxy I'm using today is Pro Paste, and it's a 2-part epoxy. Part A is the resin, and part B is the hardener. It's very important to keep these separate so they don't accidentally mix together and ruin it. So what we need to do is take one popsicle stick and take a gob out. And then about the same of the hardener. And then what I like to do is take a separate popsicle stick and blend them together. Now that our epoxy's mixed, we're on a little bit of a time clock. So we need to take some of the epoxy, spread it below that line that we made, down the rod. Doesn't need to be pretty, it just needs to be on there. And I always like to start from the top because you're sliding the cork down from the top, so that's where it's going to pull most of the epoxy from. So now I can take the butt grip and slowly twist it as I move it down the rod, so we're filling all of the spaces with epoxy. And I go just a little bit past. And you see how we pulled all the epoxy down? Put just a little bit more on the top there. And then twist it back up to it. We should be right to the end. We take our popsicle stick, just clean off a little bit at the end, and our butt grip is epoxied in place. The next step is fitting the actual reel seat itself, and this is a little bit different. A lot of handle kits come with a piece like this, which you would actually remount the same way you would remount cork, but I don't actually like to use these. I think they kind of scratch up the rod and they don't work very well. So what I prefer to use instead is masking tape. And what I do is I start down just a little bit up from the butt grip, and I'm basically just going to make a spacer with masking tape. We want to try to make this as even as we can. And the point of this is to get this to fit over this. This takes a little while, so I'm gonna actually make 3 of these. I'm gonna turn off the camera and I'll turn it on to show you when it's done. Okay, we are back, and as you can see, I've made our 3 tape rings. And if I slide the reel seat over them, it's a snug fit, and it fits right up against that cork. So what we need to do now is take our epoxy, kind of start from the top, and fill in all these gaps. I should also mention that if you're doing this for the first time, it might be a good idea to mix up smaller batches of epoxy, because this will start to harden after a little while, and once it does start to harden, there's really no turning back. Alright, so now we need to slide our reel seat across this. Now if we do this just like this and slide it across, we are going to cover our reel seat with epoxy. So what I like to do is just take a little bit of our masking tape and just put a wrap around end of it, and that just makes cleanup at the end a little bit easier. Alright, so we take, and just like with the cork, we slowly rotate as we go. As we go, it'll fill in some of those gaps. Now you can see I got kind of a gob. I'll take some of that gob, I'm going to push it down into this last section. Right now I'm just making sure that I've got all of the little
base is coated. And now we need to line up this part of our reel seat with the spine of our rod that we marked earlier. To do that, I'm just going to do it by eye, look down the rod, line it up with those lines. And that looks pretty good right there. Last step is going to be gluing on our foregrip. So I'm going to take some epoxy, spread it on. It's a good idea right here to take a little bit of masking tape and put it over the threads at the top of the reel seat just to keep the epoxy off of there. I think that should be fine. Slowly twist as we bring it down. Alright, so now this is mostly glued up. The last thing we need to do is put our butt cap on. Just used a little bit of epoxy that's left. And then I like to twist as I go just to make sure it spreads that epoxy all the way around. And then we have our winding check. When you buy a rod building kit, it usually gives you 3. I'm just giving a quick look at this. I think we're going to need the middle one. Yep. The middle one will work perfect. And what this will do is it acts as a transition between our cork and our rod blank. So again, we just take just a very small amount of our epoxy. And then smush that down against the cork. Okay, now that our rod handle is all glued up, the last step we have to do is clean it up. Once that epoxy dries, it's very hard to get off of there, so I'm going to use just a mild solvent to help wipe off the excess. At this point, the epoxy is not dry, so we don't want to wipe off too aggressively and actually start moving the cork and reel seat around because we lined that up earlier. Once we've wiped off the excess, we can take off these wraps of tape that we put on. And then all this needs to do is dry. I usually like to let this dry for about a day or so just to make sure it's fully cured before we go on to the next step. Alright everyone, thanks for watching part 2 of our rod building series. On part 3, we will be marking and wrapping the guides, which is very interesting, so if you're not sure how that's done, this would be a great episode to watch. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section below, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. Thanks again for watching Positively Fishing. This is what happens if you leave some of your cork pieces on the floor where your dog can get to them.